Welcome everybody to our SEAC meeting. I would like to welcome a couple of guests tonight online. Lisa Drake, the Chief of Language and Hearing, and Michelle Crawford-Eade, our new Officer of Inclusive Student Services. And we'll begin the meeting with the Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, the Mississauga peoples, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. It is on these ancestral and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live. And we will start off doing the roll call. And I'm just going to go through our list. Autism Ontario Durham chapter. Can you just say your name, Claudine?
Here, Claudine Burrell.
Great. Member at large, Craig. We have Carolyn. Sorry, go ahead, Carolyn.
Yeah, Carolyn McLennan.
Okay.
Member at large.
Perfect. Durham Down Syndrome Association.
Sorry, I had to find the mute there for a second. Sorry, everyone. Tara Cully, Durham Down Syndrome Association.
Excellent. Ontario Association for Families of Children with Communication Disorders.
Hi, that's me, Elizabeth Daniel.
Okay. Learning Disabilities Association of Durham Region. No? Okay. Voice for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Children.
Hi, it's Kathy Keaty.
Thank you. Association for Bright Children and SEAC Chair is myself, Eva Kyriakides. Easter Seals Ontario.
Hannah Nguyen.
Thank you. Trustees. Trustee Edwards.
Yes, Trustee Edwards for Ajax.
Okay. Trustee Thatcher.
Christine Thatcher for Whitby.
Thank you. And staff. Andrea.
Good evening. Yeah, good evening. Andrea McCauley, Superintendent of Inclusive Student Services. Eva just flagging that Rowan's joined us as well.
Rowan has joined us. Welcome, Rowan, for Learning Disabilities Association of Durham Region.
Thank you.
And we also have on our list here Lisa Drake.
Hello, Lisa Drake, Chief of Speech, Language, and Hearing Services.
Excellent. And we know we have Michelle as well.
Michelle Crawford-Eade, Inclusive Student Services.
Great. Okay. As far as I know, we didn't have any regrets. We just need to move to approve the agenda. If you could use the hand up icon, and if you don't have that, just type in the chat yes. Just that way I don't necessarily see everybody on my screen. 2, 3, 4. All right, motion is passed. Did everybody have a chance to look at the minutes from the June 18th meeting? Okay. If you have, is there any questions with respect to that? If not, we need Hannah, yeah?
No, I was trying to lower my hand, actually.
Oh, you're trying to lower your hand. Okay. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay, we need a motion to approve the minutes then. Hannah, seconded by Donna. All in favor? Okay, motion is passed. Then moving on to the presentation of the 2021 budget information.
So through you, Chair, I'd like to welcome Jen Machin and our acting interim Associate Director of Business and Finance, Carla, who will be walking us through an overview of the budget this evening. So with that, I'll turn that over to you, Carla, please.
Thanks very much, Andrea, and thanks very much for having us this evening at SEAC. The interesting thing tonight is Jen and I flipped a coin, and Jen is actually being given the opportunity to present SEAC yet again. And I just want to give some real macro highlights of what our macro budget is looking like for 2021. First of all, and then we'll go specifically into the special education funding component of the budget. But first thing to note is that the GSNs came out on June 19th, very, very, very late. As everyone knows, budgets usually, or GSNs are usually announced in March, giving school boards enough time to put their budget plans in place to be approved by boards at the end of June. So this year was exceptional in so many ways, including the time it took for them to finally release the grants. What we were told leading up to the release of the grants was that the grants were not going to significantly change this year or for next year, other than really the items that were centrally negotiated at the central tables. And that included wage increases, benefit increases. There was additional staff that was provided in those central table agreements. And that pretty well was what appeared in the budgets. There were some other adjustments in the budgets, one of which wasn't small at all, and that was the class size adjustment. It was centrally negotiated to move the secondary class size from 28 to 1 back to 23 to 1. Durham, of course, was sitting at a 22 to 1 ratio. So for us, it meant reassigning or rearranging classrooms, whereas for some other boards, they were going the other direction, and that was hiring staff. There are a couple of other realignments, I think, that were important to note. A lot of name changing and realigning budgets, putting things from what was formerly in transfer payment agreements and moving them into the GSNs. And that all took up, I guess, volumes of paper, because the GSN document, if you print it off the technical paper, it has a standard length of close to 200 pages, and most of that really was the fact that there was realignments, recategorizations, and renaming of grants. I will speak to the expenditure plan. The expenditure plan, the main areas in the expenditure plan, apart from reflecting the adjustments, as I just noted, from the GSNs in salary and class size, we did in fact identify a realignment of our WSIB budget to be more reflective of actual expenditures that we've been experiencing historically. And that we had a budget that was around 700. Our expenditures were closer to about a 4 million. So a 700,000 to a $4 million adjustment is sizable. And we did in fact have to include that, incorporate it, so that there isn't a year-end surprise. We've looked at our professional development more holistically, in that given next year and what the plan for rollout of and how schools will look next year, how programs will be delivered, we've created our pools of dollars for PD. PD will be delivered in a much more integrated way and less specific to subject areas, but much more integrated across the board. And the last item is our commitment to technology. That, of course, we've had an ongoing commitment to technology, but we were particularly focused on it this budget round in a number of areas. Not only the equipment requirements and the deployment of equipment that went out after school had closed. We have to sustain that equipment. We have to replenish that equipment, and we also need to ensure that our data security programs and measures are well in place. And so funding has been also put in place to support those aspects of the budget. Your interest this evening, I'm sure, is very much focused on special education funding, and Jen has prepared a presentation that she'll walk you through, and then we'll open it up to any questions you have. So thanks, Jen.
Thank you. So thank you so much for having us this evening. I'm just going to try and get this presentation working here. Great. So the purpose of the presentation this evening is to provide your committee information regarding the special education funding model. So I'll talk first about the special education grants, then move on to the new Supports for Student Fund through Pupil, and then talking about revenue and expenditures for 2021, describing some priorities in partnerships funding, and some additional information on meetings that are upcoming. So the special education grant is the component of the GSN which supports students with special education needs. It may only be used for these kind of programs, services, and equipment, and any unspent funding must be put aside and spent on special education in the future. So this is strictly the minimum amount that needs to be spent on special education. We certainly can spend more with other GSN funds, and we do. And I'll touch on that a little bit later and show you the envelope for special education. So the grant's made up of 6 different allocations. They all will look familiar except from the second to last one, the Education and Community Partnership Program. That's actually the former CTCC amount that they've just renamed. So the first aspect of the grant, the Special Education Per Pupil Amount, or SEPA, is to assist with the cost of providing additional support to students with special education needs. So although it's allocated to support special education students, it's based on total enrollment of all students of the board. So it's allocated on the basis of total ADE, which is average daily enrollment, multiplied by a benchmark rate. So I've just added a chart on this slide so you can see there was a slight increase for 2021 over the 1920 rates. And I'll summarize that change on a revenue slide so you can see at a macro level what that translated to. The next portion of the grant is a differentiated special needs amount, DSENA. So there was no significant changes to the grant this year. It still includes 4 components: the special education statistical prediction model, measures of variability, a base amount for collaboration and integration, and multidisciplinary support. Something interesting to note this year was the information regarding the calculation of this grant was included right in the technical paper. So it used to only be in a special document describing special education funding. So we were glad to see that it was added right in the technical paper, which we use to calculate our grants from the ministry this year. The special equipment amount is to support the purchase of equipment that may be required by students with special education needs. And it's made up of 2 different components: the per pupil amount. So similarly to the other components of other grants, the base amount for each school board and a total ADE multiplied by a benchmark rate. There was no year-over-year change to the grant this year. We also have a claims-based funding portion. So in that, we cover the cost of an individual student's non-computer-based equipment needs. So we submit a claim by individual student. Special incidents portion is to support students who require more than 2 full-time staff. So funding is based on claims submitted by boards, but there is a maximum amount per claim. And if you look at this chart on the slide, you can see it's gone up by $556 per claim this year. So again, the Education and Community Partnership Programs, or ECPP, was previously the Care, Treatment, Custody, and Correctional Amount. So this is to support provision of education programs to school-aged children and youth in care, including hospitals, children's mental health centers, or detention centers. And the funding is based on an approval process. So it's specified in a guideline issued for the program. And it's important to note that our revenue can be reduced if the projected amount approved is greater than the actual expenditures. So what that means is that funding is enveloped for that program. Next, we have the behavior expertise amount. So this is funding to hire professional staff who have expertise in applied behavior analysis. So the model has 2 components, and both are comprised of a base amount for each school board and a total average daily enrollment multiplied by a benchmark rate. You can see the expertise professionals amount has increased a little bit over last year, while the ABA training amount has remained the same. It is important to note, however, that ABA training amount is enveloped funding and it must be used specifically for ABA training purposes. So I just wanted to briefly touch on the CUPE Supports for Students Fund. This funding has had many names. We used to call it the Local Priorities Funding, and in the labor negotiations agreement, it's referred to as the Investments in System Priorities, but now it's been included in the Grants for Student Needs as the Support for Students Fund. So it's an allocation of $1.655 million, and it will be used for the addition of 29 additional education assistants. And that's built into the budget for this year. So my apologies, this is small. There was no good way to fit this on the slide, but what this is a snapshot of our special education envelope. So I would just ask you to look at the very bottom line. You can see it says total special education surplus deficit, and you can see by that the overspending in the special education envelope is $4.677 million. That's actually down a little bit from 4.9 million, but you can see there is significant investment in the programs by the board. I'd also just like to point out that I have added in the Supports for Students funding in a separate line at the bottom. So you can see the bottom section of that document refers to that specialized funding. So areas of focus in the special education budget this year were support for education assistance, as well as professional learning, so supports in compassion fatigue and trauma-informed practice. I also just wanted to briefly touch on budget risk. This is a very unique year, and as such, there are a number of risks inherent in our budget. First being unanticipated enrollment decreases. Enrollment is the main driver of revenue, so any enrollment decrease may impact our revenue estimates. In addition to that, we may have revenue changes, such as additional clawbacks from the ministry or ministry-directed childcare revenue reductions. At the same time, we have unanticipated cost pressures next year due to COVID. That could impact staffing, supply costs, transportation costs, and technology costs. There's a lot of unknowns right now. So outside of our Grants for Student Needs funding, we have separate funding called the Priorities and Partnerships Funding, or PPF. Some of you may remember they used to be called Education Programs Other, or EPO grants. So these grants are governed by very specific agreements that outline the purpose of the funding, and any unspent amounts are generally to be returned to the ministry or whoever the provider is. The majority of these are from the Ministry of Education. However, they could come from different ministries and agencies. I wanted to point out one that was continuing for the 2021 school year, the After School Skills Development, ASSD programs for students with autism spectrum disorder. So we have received that funding for the past few years, and we have received confirmation from the ministry that it will continue in 2021. And the allocation for the DDSB is $135,000. So this slide just outlines the Education Finance Committee meeting schedule. We had a meeting on July 2nd to present the preliminary draft budget. We have this special meeting this evening, and tomorrow we have another Public Education Finance Committee meeting, which will include public deputations, and then if required as well, a special meeting on July 15th. So we would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
If anybody has a question, just raise your hands or type it in the chat so I can go in order. Tara, go ahead.
Hang on. I have many questions, so if other people would like to go first, I'll get to mine at the end, because otherwise I monopolize all the time.
No. Donna is ready to go ahead. Donna, you're muted.
Well, yeah, we'll let Tara go first, and then she probably might ask some of the questions that I have. So
we may have some of the same questions. Yeah.
I'm going to go with you're presenting tomorrow, so let's get your questions answered.
Okay. Well, I think some of them will follow through. I think that I'm assuming that's one of the agenda items for later that we'll have the discussion on the presentation that I sent out in direct relation to this. So just going through some of the notes, Jennifer, thank you. And thank you, Carla, for all of that. I know you guys have had to kind of work really, really fast to get all this through. So just really quick on that ABA training amount that was at $1,500 per board. What does that really do for a board the size of the DDSB? Is that you just said per board, and I wasn't sure what that meant.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Thank you. And so through you, Eva. Tara, we use that to fund the work of the autism resource team and the training that they do out. Most recently, evidence-based programs such as STAR and the communication program we've been using with our littles. Any of our ABA-based plans, even the launch of the D2L modules on contingency mapping and understanding and students' programming needs and then implementing. So we use it direct to support capacity building in the system. Our team is really protective over the dollars and stretching them as far as we can to grow supports for kids.
Okay, thanks. Glad to see that the local priorities funding got replaced. That was very happy. The other big one, which I think is kind of the elephant in the room on this one, is the COVID. So you said budget risks and all of the very much unknowns of what that's going to look like in the fall. What have we accounted for in this budget in terms of PPE, in terms of staffing, cleaning, all those things that we know are going to have to occur regardless? Is any of that actually in this budget to reflect those things? Or what we think it's going to reflect?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll definitely I'll agree with you in that there is a lot of unknowns, and our ability to forecast exactly how next year is going to unfold is very challenging. What we have identified in the budget and what we're aggressively working on right now is securing our PPE requirements, putting 2 months in our inventory before we start the school year, and securing our supplies for the balance of the year. We are looking at masks certainly for staff. And when I speak about this, I'm talking about it in the context of staff and for staff and students in situations where the distance can't be maintained and the distance of 6 feet. So for certainly a number of special education programs, there is going to be a requirement for masks and PPE to be well stocked in a school. Cleaning supplies, again, is another area of having to secure them early. Our purchasing department has been fabulous, and they've been working on this pretty well since the closure. And we have actually secured a whole year's worth of supply of a particularly important disinfectant that has been identified by public health as the one to use. We've locked that down for the year, which is great. And so all schools will be well equipped and well supplied. And most of it will be held in our central maintenance center, and then schools will be provided as their inventories run low at the school level. In terms of anticipating additional staff requirements, the one thing that we are pleased about is that the ministry did, in fact, increase staffing for a number of positions. Teachers being one group, EAs being another. 29 was what was identified and has been included in the budget. We have additional custodian staff identified, like funding for custodian staff has been identified as well. That all came through central bargaining, and that really has been built into the budget. Now it's a process, the hiring process has to continue in order to get those positions filled. What we need beyond that is difficult to anticipate. Again, it depends on the school model that ends up rolling out and whether or not that model is able to continue for the balance or for the whole year, or will we have to shift gears because all of a sudden we experience a considerable outbreak where we'll have to figure out distance learning again. We have built in, and we continue to buy technology through the summer. We are looking at our surpluses from 1920, recognizing our budgets were put on hold. The ministry did not claw back much more than a bit under the transportation category, where they recognized that we weren't, consuming the fuel. So they pulled back the fuel component. For us, that meant $563,000. We, in fact, did not pull it back from our operators, but are using it as a credit for them to make sure that they are putting the right cleaning protocols in place for the school buses, and also equipping their staff with the right PPE in order for them to service our students come September. So we've tried as best as we can to anticipate what those increases are, and they are included in the budget. As I said, technology was an area of considerable focus, and we're buying now. We continue to buy technology, and as we go into September, we feel pretty confident that we'll have the devices for distance learning to continue. The challenge is really around PPE. And I'll be honest with you, that's the one that probably gives me the greatest concern is I don't know what truly it will look like we don't know what it will look like in September, and what the requirements will be for PPE. And if all boards are out there and all public institutions are out there trying to secure the masks, the shields, and other, other articles, that does put a lot of pressure on the entire system, which is, I think, one of the reasons that the public health units were coming out with a kind of fuzzy initial announcement around masks. That is the concern for us. And that's why we're trying as best as we can to lock down a whole year's inventory for these kinds of supplies. The cost to that, if we've had to expand it out to every single child in our system, every day that they attend school, there's 72,000 students, and you multiply that by the number of days in a school year, 194, that's an awful lot of money. And I don't think it's almost inconceivable to think about daily supplies of that. So that's our challenge. That's it right there. One of the biggest ones. I mean, there's many challenges, but that's one of the biggest ones that causes concern with the budget that's been presented this evening.
Right. So, and I know that when I was looking at some of the memorandums from the MOE, the Ministry of Education, they had mentioned that there's potential for additional funding, but there was no guarantee. It was just, yeah, we'll make sure you guys get what you need, but I'm not sure, what does that mean? So for you, is it more of a supply problem or a dollars problem?
Oh, it's both.
Both.
The announcement they had initially was around an additional $4 million. Well, we could consume that just in our school board, let alone thinking about all the other school boards, 72 boards out there. The other thing that the ministry indicated is that COVID-related costs, we could use our surpluses from the 1920 school year to address those COVID-related costs. Well, in part, we're doing that because we're spending on technology. It's difficult, and we will buy the PPE and the cleaning supplies that we can get our hands on right now, and certainly put that to good use. That'll be eliminated or evaporated before we start the school year, let alone going into the next school year and then trying to anticipate additional expenses along those same supplies. And so it's a very serious concern.
Regarding mental health, there was also something tapped for $10 million in mental health resourcing. How much of that was actually allocated to the DDSB?
Good question. There's two components. They announced a mental health component, 10 million, and they announced a 15 million technology component. So it was a $25 million announcement that day. School boards are still waiting to receive their specific allocations.
Okay. What do we think we're getting? Do we even have a guess?
You know what? It's difficult to know on what basis they're going to allocate that. And that's the reason I'm really hesitating to guess. I mean, if they just did a simple proration, you know, it may be a fair enough calculation, but I have a feeling they're going to factor in things like how much is in your inventory. They're asking us a lot of questions about our own inventories, about where we're anticipating to end the year. And I kind of think they're going to tailor make that table amount.
Okay. Okay. For technology, you'd mentioned hardware. What about software and licensing? What's the costs associated with that? I'm assuming that we had a bunch of uptick in software licensing requirements this past year.
Yeah,
and going forward.
And it's a good question again, Tara. It's another area that the ministry has decided to change course on. They had about 15 to 20 provincial licenses in place for technology that we could, or for software that we could access. They are pulling that back. Those licenses will expire over time, and up until around December when they finally all expire. And they've instead replaced that with a $35,000 allocation to the to DDSB. Again, it was a specific amount to each board, so that leaves a gap alone. We spend, though, in software licensing, we spend more than even what the provincial licensing would have represented. And I don't have the exact figure unless Jen does, but I can say that the value of the provincial licenses was about $200,000. They're replacing that with a $35,000 allocation to us. So there, let alone, is a gap. Now, we didn't use all those provincial licenses. There were some that we didn't use. But the ones that we are reviewing to determine whether or not we want to enter into a licensing agreement, we will have to pick up that cost again within our technology budgets and software budgets that we're aligned for next year.
Okay. All right. I'm really sorry. I have a lot of questions. Just around the whole conversation about what in-class looks like and some of the recommendations coming from the ministry around average around 15 students, no more in a classroom. What does that really look like to us? I'm thinking full day kindergarten teams, which have a teacher and an ECE, but that was with the full complement of children. What does that do to our students? Do we need ECs? Is there conversations that need to be had, or do we just move everybody to more classrooms? Do we have the classrooms to do that? Hi, Andrea.
Yeah,
so I think
Andrea's in a good spot because there's models that are being worked on, and Andrea's involved in that.
Yeah, I think there's two aspects to that. One is the financial arm of the organization, and then what does it implement like? And so I would refer SEAC to the agenda for the public board session for tomorrow evening. Acting Director Marsh is bringing forth a report on our reopening and the modeling. And so there were surveys done of staff, surveys done of families, and we really looked at that data. And then around student needs, the health protocols, the direction from the ministry. And when you bring all of that information kind of into the mixing bowl, there was a strong number of models that came forth from that. And there are two that we're putting forth as kind of the ones that are most congruent between elementary and secondary, but the other models are there. So in the public agenda, it begins on page 19 of that document. But I would also like to draw SEAC's attention to a specific paragraph on page 37. And again, because this is being publicly released as our thinking at this time. So we are at this time planning on cohorts of no more than 15 within a classroom at any point in time, which does create cohort A and cohort B, where students would be attending part of the week and accessing independent and real-time learning. We also are cognizant that there may be some families that choose to remain at home, kind of a cohort C. And expect that be a fairly fluent. But what's stated on page 37 is really important from SEAC. What we heard from the ministry was that students that have intensive support needs from a special education and or mental health perspective were to have regular daily access to schools. And so how that's being defined within our proposed plan is those reviewed into special education classes where the programming is based on alternate or modified curriculum and a class size of less than 15. So what that means from an implementation perspective is that our elementary gifted learners would be on the cohort model because they're working off the regular full curriculum.
Oh, did we lose Andrea?
I think she's frozen.
Uh-oh.
Are in the planning for regular daily participation in school. It's a little harder to do hand over hand life skills training through time projection to home, and so that intensive support. It also means too that when we're looking at cohorts of 15, that's including students and staff, and so all of those smaller class placements, we're able to do that inclusive of community supports such as nursing, OT, and PT care as well. So those considerations are absolutely there, again, under the ministry's definition of students requiring intensive supports. So I just draw SEAC's attention to that public document. It's being presented to the Board of Trustees, including Trustee Thatcher and Trustee Edwards tomorrow night. And then we'll go for submission to the ministry. We're anticipating hearing feedback from the ministry August 4th. And then we'll dive deeper into programming at that time. All boards are submitting around now based on the health protocols. But to your question too, Tara, around kindergarten, and I turn to our finance team for confirmation, we have heard no hint of any change to the kindergarten model or any move from the prior confirmation statement that we heard that there was no change to the kindergarten model. We heard that earlier this spring, and there's been no revisiting or hint towards any change because there still would be ideally that cohort of 30 learners. They'd just be separated between the half at school and half at home at any point in time based on the model at this time.
Great, thank you. And then just a few more questions, not related to COVID, surprisingly. The mandatory e-learning, I know we still have that in the mix. However, there's also been reference in the memorandums about the exemption process for parents. They may opt out, but that process is yet not truly defined. Has the budget factored in that if a significant number of parents opt out of this mandatory e-learning, do we have to replace that staffing or replace those classes or courses? Is there any impacts to the budget because of that potential opting out?
The answer is no, there's not an impact other than on the revenue side. The ministry made their assumption and actually removed $88,000 based on a calculation, an average calculation provincially. So our per pupil amount, when it came to the class size adjustment, they actually then applied the $88,000 reduction for the 30-to-1 in the assumption they made. As for our staffing, we did not assume anything in staffing as a mandatory 2 courses. We're assuming, in fact, the opposite. We're staffed at 23-to-1 and believing that all students will be taking the courses in person.
Okay. Okay. And we're still waiting, I think, for the revised OAP model for the Ontario Autism program and how that's going to affect influx of students' needs and how we're going to allocate funding for that. I know we don't have anything. Have we made any provisions for that yet?
Correct. So through you, Eva. We have the asset of a responsive EA allocation model that the team meets 13 times a year, comparative to many boards who do their EA allocation. I believe the average is about twice a year, just with that term or semester changeover adjustment point. Our committee is continually reviewing that. As I said, we have agreement with CUPE that we do that 13 times a year. So we are aware of that. We know that through previous consultations with SEAC and our community partners, that it will be within the primary junior grades that the greatest impact of any OAP changes will come through. We see students that, or children and youth that have been in prolonged service as the model's gone under a number of freezes. That means that there were students off cycle that haven't gone back on cycle, and there were children that have not yet come into service that otherwise would have as well. And then the group in the middle who have stayed in service through this period of time. So very similarly, we await any news based on a really thorough review of those recommendations from the OAP table that looked at that and came out with those robust cross-ministerial recommendations that were quite thorough. But locally, no information has landed for us at this time. So we have got a Durham region table that was meeting regularly. We froze when we went into job action and then certainly into COVID. But that table would kick up again very quickly to be responsive to any changes. And that has partners such as Lake Ridge Community Support Services, Kinark, ourselves, Grove, around the table so that we can take a family-centric approach to be responsive.
Okay. I guess last question I have, and then Donna, you can ask your question. So sorry. There's still the conversation about the new math curriculum that's coming in, additional training, additional costs associated to implementing that. Have we factored that in yet, since that just sort of dropped on our laps as well?
So again, through you, Madam Chair, I just, there is an allocation for the math strategy that was provided in the transfer payment amounts. I think it's close to $1 million, 999,000. The details with respect to the TPA have yet to be provided. And so how much of it will be, directed, we don't know yet. But the funding seems to be there for the implementation of the math strategy.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. I'm done. Thanks, Eva.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm just assuming that.
Yeah, go ahead, Donna.
Next. Just a couple of questions in the comments. One was under the central agreements, you definitely mentioned CUPE, but there was also some funding that was generated through OSSTF, and it wasn't mentioned in the slides, but I'm pretty sure it's also incorporated into the budget. Is that not correct?
Yes, that is correct. All staffing.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
It's important to put that in there though, because it was, again, bargained by our unions and really, we support that, and they're part of the decision on how that is allocated and where things are going. And I know that we've done that. The second thing is just a question around the ECPP, just an understanding around there was a decrease, and as long as and how that affects students and the students that we support.
Thank you so much, and I greatly appreciate that when we have a conversation around SEAC, we recognize the EDU education academic side, but we also recognize our standing as a treatment program lead for about 6 boards geographically. So there is a decrease of just under 200,000 to our Grove overall budget. The ECPP, so Education Community Partnership Programs, formerly the CTCC, is based on an application cycle. So the team applies for funding, and then it's an annual response to that. A component to that is our actual costs and reporting of our actual costs. So there's 2 impacts that are resulting in the approximately $192,000 change. One is that we had forecasted all Grove staffing based on top grade teacher salaries and benefits, because historically we've seen teachers experienced in regular day school come over to serve at-risk children and youth through Grove. Most recently, we've had people with developmental services backgrounds, CYW backgrounds that become BEd trained, enter into teaching, but with a heart and a passion for service to the same children and youth, and come into staffing direct to Grove as a first stop or as LTOs. We had a high number of LTOs within the long-term vocational teachers, within the 19-20 school year. So when we reported our 19-20 actuals, we were slightly lower in staffing costs than originally forecasted, and then that impacts for 2021. The other significant, and this takes the bulk of the change, is that one of our partners, Joanne's House, which is a shelter-based program for youth, in the evaluation of their service and hearing from their clientele, they felt their funding was better rooted to street-facing and grassroots CYW contact with youth needing those supports for housing, mental health, kind of a gateway or doorway program. And so Joanne's House notified us that they would be closing out of ECPP partnership with us. And so where we saw the majority of that decrease in funding is actually the paired teacher salary that would run that program. So we see a closeout of the program with Joanne's House. But we are catching the students as youth within our region, part of the mental health support that used to be kind of enveloped for mental health workers in secondary schools that we now see as part of our GSN funded supports. We already have a social worker working out of Durham Alternate Secondary School. We're now going to pair that with psych services staff working in partnership. And we feel that a lot of the clients that used to go through Joanne's House will be caught through DAS and served through that means. So not losing sight of the youth on the other side, but respectful of our partner's decision to close out of the kind of program-based approach to service.
And I appreciate that, and as far as that, but as you said, we do have that care and treatment obligation as well, and it's really critical, especially when you look at youth and what's happening, and around mental health, and huge concerns around the fact that we still haven't received what that allocation is, mental health. Along that with the announcement that was just yesterday around, now I know suspension and expulsions are fairly low within our board and so forth, but this whole thing of there will be no suspensions for grade 3 under. And we just know that with COVID-19 and the anxieties and so forth that is coming, we're going to have an increased need. And I recognize you've put in training around trauma and everything else, which is really, really great. But there is still going to be that increased need. And, you know, there's huge concerns from communities about what that's going to look like in that type of support, and just the additional stress that administrators are going to have. I mean, they already have stress, but they're going to be dealing with COVID-19 and how that's going to be, and how we're going to support staff and those families, because and honestly, one of the terms that have come out across the province and some of the other places is the whole exclusion clause being overly used. And I know we rarely use it, but it is a huge concern with communities because of, you know, you're dealing with safety, that principals are going to be overwhelmed. That's going to be used in order to ensure safety of students. So just comments around that.
No, and through you, Chair. So very fair comments. And Superintendent Davis will be leading that work around the protocols and safety procedures. I think one of the great assets of how we're set up in Durham is we see that intersect of mental health linked between ISS, like inclusive student services, safe schools, mental health and well-being, that Superintendent Davis and I and the two teams that we have the privilege of working with work really closely on that intersect. So we look forward to supporting her leadership of that. I would fully agree that we're going to see students and staff re-enter buildings in September, not as the day after we left in March. We are changed by our common experience, and I use common loosely because there's certainly been, I know, a check of privilege on my behalf from a number of perspectives, just in terms of food, income, housing continuity, We look at how a long brewing and needing to surface race crisis and how we look at anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism and surfacing that, and how our students and families feel coming back into a system acknowledging that we need to change some longstanding practices in that way. And so how do we all come back into learning, and how do we equip educators who are math specialists and reading specialists and science specialists to guide that work in classrooms? Well, they have probably part of their kids with them and part of their kids at home, and then manage their home responsibilities as well. So our staff is taking a look at things. Thank you for referencing the trauma-informed practice. We had a 3-year kind of program that we had launched last fall. We've crunched the timeline on that and said we need to go kind of to full year 3 right away in terms of that trauma-informed practice. And so we've reached out to partners such as Tend Academy, who previously did compassion fatigue training for our ISS staff. We had it planned for administrators and it went on pause with job action and certainly this spring. So that's right at the forefront, as well as another community partner, Safeguard, who specializes in responding to trauma that has a race base to how that's being imposed on individuals. So we recognize that our staff has good expertise, but this requires a community response and a reach out, and how do we do that together, to do that work together. So compassion fatigue, yes. Trauma-informed practice, absolutely. I keep sounding like a bit of a broken record on this one too, but I really think an important distinguishment that we need to make is that being informed of someone's trauma and keeping that in mind as you work with them is very distinct from trauma-informed practice. I think our educators are very good at being informed of trauma and keeping that in mind, but we need to shift as a system to do trauma-informed practice and what that shifts, and how we grow that across the system. We work on the tiered model of all, some, few, and usually our trauma-informed practice comes in for the few. What Superintendent Davis and I have talked about with our teams is we've actually inverted the triangle coming in for the 2021 school year, where we should be assuming that the majority of our kids are coming and re-entering with some form of trauma through the pandemic. And then we can't lose sight that there will be a few of our kids who have thrived in this environment. All the pressures are off, they've thrived, but now they're ready and have a thirst to be back with other people. So we kind of take that all, some, few, flip it upside down, and that's how we're approaching the 2021 school year. And you see that reflected when you're able to see the board budget book in kind of the priorities, both summer learning and into the fall. We're really focused on equity, naming anti-Black racism as something that we need to systemically take a look at and intentionally respond to, and anti-Indigenous racism as well, looking at trauma-informed practices, and then how do we continue to grow the skills of our educators to work in that hybrid model of growing digital learning and responding to students. So we have said as a board, those are our absolute priorities. And in the presentation from our finance team, you heard that kind of we've rescoped our PD dollars. So rather than being fragmented across departments, those are our priorities, and how do we do that together with the teams that we have privilege to work with? So I agree with you, it's an absolute need. It's a complex problem to work through, but it's an essential one for us to be engaged and ensure follow-up through.
Yeah. And just to follow up on that, it's just that, as I said, it really is ramping up speed around the exclusion. And in that note, I know that there was one organization that did a survey of school boards around exclusion policies, and we do not have one. We have specifically around exclusion. We do have around progressive discipline and suspension and whatever, but not dealing with exclusion. And I think that it would probably be a good idea to take a look at that, and to ensure that there's information around, as far as how it can be used and when it shouldn't be. And I know that we have that under progressive discipline, but I think we really do need to put something out there.
So if I may, Eva, is that right?
Yep.
Through you, Chair. Absolutely, and we'll take that back. You have two members of the senior team here on screen, so Carla and I can take that back for sure. I do agree that although there's not a policy, we do have a procedure around 265M. So the section of the Education Act that deals with exclusion is 265M, and quite often that's how we'll refer to it with administrators. I greatly appreciate your comment that we don't lean heavily on that in Durham at all. That's not our intention. And so when that is surfaced, it is short-term and for the benefit of the student that's at the heart of the concern for their safety and those working most directly with them. But I would agree, part of a larger scope that we've talked about between senior team and trustees as well is making sure that we have alignment between procedures and policies and ensuring that there's that through line. We're sitting in a bit of a disconnect in terms of there always being that pairing. And we've heard Acting Director Marsh speak to that commitment to work through in the months ahead. So thank you for your comment.
Yeah, and just, you know, SEAC definitely should be involved in that whole, you know, discussion and whatever around that as well as is input. But thank you, and again, I do want to recognize that our staff have been very good, and you know, exclusion is limited, and I know that, but it's best to be prepared, and that we say we have this. People can look at it and say we have this policy in place and procedure in place. Thanks.
Yeah, are there any more questions with respect to the budget? Sorry, is that Rowan? Yeah, go ahead, Rowan.
Hi, it's just a quick question. I was just looking at the presentation, went a little quick for me. And so I just wanted to see, in terms of that money that was coming, how it might be supporting like the Learning Disability Association, the Learning Disability community rather, with respect to the students. I know it's very high level, but just to get an idea, I can take back to my group. Thanks.
Go ahead, Andrea. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So Rowan, great question, because when we go back to the heart of SEAC, as a collective, you represent all students in the region and advocacy for them. But we do appreciate that each of you come to the table representing a specific organization and agency. And I think that's really important to keep in mind as well. So thank you for your question. We can take time too and go back through it to identify more specifically. I think when we look at our learners who are LD as a cohort, we know that they are our largest group within our students who are identified. We know that largely when we go to kind of those three common accommodations, we're missing kids in terms of those assumptions of more time, quiet space, and a computer, that it needs to be far more robust in looking at the individualized aspects. I think the answer to your question sits across a number of portfolios. So Superintendent Maliha, in terms of the technology implementation, we know when the technology is infused in a classroom, those SIA devices get used way more. So when we see that kind of full implementation of the one-to-one device program, we no longer have computers sitting on shelves that kids don't want to be stigmatized in bringing. And we know that programs like Read and Write are really critical for our kids with LD to organize their amazing thoughts and communicate their great thinking. In terms of Superintendent Neville's and curriculum, when we look at intervention strategies and resources that are being purchased for our classrooms, again, we want to make sure that those reading fluency levels are met, that we're pacing intervention groupings, and honoring that average to high intelligence of our LD learners, and how are we building classroom programs to support that. So I think there's a bit of a ubiquitous answer to your question, because the answer is it's not specifically identified, but it's kind of everywhere within the budget and support. But I do appreciate your question in that it causes reflection that Lisa and Michelle and I can take back to the rest of the leadership team too, to make sure that as we're planning for the ISS dollars, we're looking through the lens of each cohort of our learners to make sure we're being very intentional in strategies and setting them up for success. So sorry, it's not a very specific question, but I know that yourself and Carrie and Wendy, we can sit and do some planning around that as well.
And that was just sort of the idea. I realized that what's on the table right now is a monumental task, and that everyone's working to take care of everybody. So, but I think the idea, as you said, we're all representing a group, and to be able to look at it through different lenses is important. So, but I definitely take up on that meeting after the fact. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions with respect to the budget? No? Okay. Sorry. Yeah, Catherine?
I've been sitting here trying to write this question on the chat and I can't get it out in a way that makes sense. So I just, I think that we've already addressed a lot of the last minute things like math, but because there hasn't been a policy yet, but a Toronto Star announcement about de-streaming, I just wondered how that might be. Like, I'm thrilled about de-streaming, don't get me wrong, because I think we sometimes hear the question wrong. I think it is brilliant and has been fought for a long time. However, to be done well, just like integrating students, it requires the right support. So I'm just wondering what work is afoot to make sure that students who might be put into that 23-to-1 average, not class size, because I think we have to always keep naming that we've had a change in language there as well, how that's going to have an impact on our special ed students.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Carla, I don't know. Do you want to? And then I can jump
The
in.
only comment I'll make, I mean, the de-streaming announcement came out the other day. Reality is the staffing's already been done. There were no specific timelines associated with that announcement, and we could only imagine that they couldn't possibly be thinking of de-streaming being put in place for September 2020. We're thinking about 2021 realistically, because as you correctly point out, it takes time to transition, and we need to look at it from not only the staffing side of it, but also what makes sense for kids that will be organized differently. So Andrea, you might have more insight.
Yeah, just to follow up on that too, I think it's announcement that collectively there's a positive response to, that educators, families, the students themselves would see this as the rightful move and a celebration of that direction. Boards have received no communication at this point, and we look forward to seeing, as Carla said, the details of that plan come forward. At this time, the only information we know is that which is within the Toronto Star report as well.
Donna, you had something to add?
Yeah, I just and I recognize that we haven't received anything in that. Unfortunately, when it comes to communication, we talked this earlier. Communication is sometimes a little bit inconsistent, and there are other articles out there that saying September 2020. So that's starting to get some anxiety up as far as parents and so forth. So, and then, you know, again, when we talk about communications as well around, you know, maths, because of the Durham region has now said that public places require masks. And so, you know, why would a parent think that, you know, they didn't require masks in school because that's a public place? You know, there's kids in there, and I'm recognizing this a kid's study. So I mean, that's the thing is this fighting this consistent messaging for some of the things that come out is really difficult, and also increasing anxieties around the parent and the communities going through there. And I know that we have to deal with it, but the sooner the better we can get those answers. And I know through Officer we'll try to get those answers too, but to get those answers, the better. And just thinking of the mask thing, because I remember, and I've got to remember which document, I've read so many documents, and I was pretty sure it was that large document or a detailing for plans for boards, where it actually suggested that parents provide cloth masks for their kids. But then there's the whole thing about, you know, can they afford to buy them? What happens if the younger kids, they lose them, and so forth, and that whole thing, and the requirement of ensuring that they're clean because they have to be washed, and to ensure that they do what they're supposed to be doing. So I mean, that whole consistency of the communication is really got to be key. If anything, within with Durham. And I do recognize that a lot of the groups that I've been involved in around the planning have said that boards should reflect their regional health, because the regional health is supposed to be, so it would be. In some provinces, regional health hasn't said masks are required, where others have. And so that's a huge issue. But consistency is, somehow we've got to get that consistent message as quick as we can. As I know that every one of you are doing a phenomenal job of trying to get those answers and working really hard. But recognize that we do have to get that consistent message to relieve the anxiety in the community.
Okay. Any other questions or comments with respect to that?
Thinking about masking, I have a couple of comments. I believe that the recommendations from the Sick Kids Hospital actually suggested that kids not wear masks because of concern about, touching the masks and fiddling with them and not really being able to adhere to the strict infection control precautions. And then I know within my organization, we've talked about masking from the perspective of communication. And how covering the mouth makes it harder to hear and harder to pick up on social communication cues and harder to model speech sounds and that sort of thing. So we're really awaiting clarification too. And those points are maybe lower on the totem pole when you consider procurement and funding, but still need to be considered at some point. There are such thing as masks that have little clear panels. So perhaps if it was a speech language pathologist, that could be a consideration if we could get our hands on those. Or understanding when a face shield could be used instead of a mask. So those are all questions I think for further down the road.
I think Lisa has a comment on that. Yeah.
Thanks, Liz. It's actually really nice to see you. I know we've had some emails back and forth, so it's finally nice to sort of meet you in real life. It's really, as a speech pathologist as well, I take that point very, very strongly. And in fact, it's not too soon to start considering it. This is something that we've been talking about for many weeks, maybe perhaps months at this point. We are definitely considering the communication impacts of the PPE that will be in the schools. So for example, for the students who have been identified as deaf and hard of hearing, absolutely face shields are going to be essential. We had some of our hearing resource teachers trial some of the masks that had the clear section in it so that you could see the mouth moving. And unfortunately, the condensation really built up. And so the ventilation wasn't factored in when they were designed, unfortunately. So we learned pretty quickly that wasn't going to be a viable option. So we have looked at those situations where we do indeed need to have clear face shield or other form of protective barrier versus a mask, because that is going to be something that's critical for so many of our students throughout the entire system. So thank you for bringing it up, and please know that that's absolutely something that we are considering. If you learn more as you're working through your own organization, please reach out to me. We are always looking for more ideas, more input, and hearing what else is being thought of.
So I was to say, I might add to that just quickly as sort of this discussion is gone on with that. You're talking about face shields, I'm assuming for the teachers and for the child. But also I'm thinking for their fellow classmates, because again, without a face shield for them, they would miss that communication with their peers that they wouldn't be able to then have if they're masked.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely it's a consideration that we have very clear in our minds for those students, especially the ones, those students who really do have difficulty picking up on the auditory signal and need to have complete access to all the different forms of communication available to them. So looking at all of the different communicators that they come across through their day is critical.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrea.
I think just add on to that as well too. So we, and as Liz pointed out, we have the Hospital for Sick Kids recommendation, and we see some other leading medical institutions that serve children and youth come out with very similar recommendations. And then certainly on Facebook, there's a lot of teacher memes about all the misuses of masks and how kids, they would become discipline issues in that regard. And then we see our local health department identify masks for anyone over 2 as mandatory in public space. So we just really look to our health department for clarification on that as well too, because we always have that debate on whether schools are public spaces or not. Because sometimes we have, especially when we're under cohorts and pandemic response, that locked door closed environment with the cohorting safety. And so I think that's something too, that some of the protocols may take care of themselves a little bit in that regard, that will look after those working in proximity to students. But I think the student-to-student communication and things like that may take care of themselves, just as that feathers out in the details of whether schools get defined as that public space required or not.
Okay. Is there anything else before we move on to Tara's presentation for tomorrow?
I'm so sorry. I have one more question. I was just going back through all my notes and I'm like, oh shoot, I forgot to ask the question. In regards to our school-based rehabilitative services, thank you, Andrea, for the appropriate acronym there. One of the things normally that is all being delivered in the in-school models, with the potential for remote learning and those sorts of things. What have we considered what potential impacts, especially from a resourcing standpoint? We know that there's been the recommendations not to have people go in and out of schools, and Andrea, you just referred to sort of a closed door sort of environment once we're in there. Is there additional impacts and resources that we have to consider for that? Go ahead, Andrea.
Oh, sorry. So Eva, through you. So thank you for the question. So one of the assets of many of the changes over the last few years is we see school-based rehab services consolidated with one partner. So Grandview Children's Center is our single provider for that aspect of speech, different from Lisa's team, OT and PT services. Throughout this pandemic phase, we've remained in communication with the planning team at Grandview. They did move all of their services onto a virtual platform, all of their OT, PT, as well as their speech. And so we'll be working closely with the Grandview team. They're excited to come back into service face-to-face as well. Certainly a foundation of SBRS is school-based rehabilitative services. So we'll be working with them. Again, their jurisdiction oversits about 6 boards. A few of them are Durham Region Health, a couple are not. So it's navigating EDU, Grandview, and a few different health departments that may be approving different plans. Essentially, anybody that would be operating on school site will come through our health and safety. We'll have to see evidence that Durham Region has approved their service plan and that it's in alignment. But we've certainly started the conversation around clinical spaces and what that looks like, sounds like. Our orientation mobility specialist is on contract with us. And just we have a number of different partners that are essential in delivery of programming. Community partners in nursing. Many of our developmental programs would not run without that partnership being embedded. And so over about the next 4 weeks or so, we'll be working closely. But it'll really come through a coordination through Carla's team to make sure the health protocols are there while we move service for kids that's supposed to be integrated in their planning. So thank you for surfacing that really important partnership. It's one we greatly value. And we'll be working in close connect with them and then bringing that back, as I said, through Carla's health and safety team for approval and assurance that the health protocols are there.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there anything else before we move on to Tara's presentation for tomorrow? Okay, Tara, the floor is yours as far as...
It feels like I've talked already, way too much.
Sorry,
everyone.
Eva, my apologies. Just before you get to Tara, may we thank our business and finance team because they'll both be at the presentation tomorrow evening, and always appreciate their company and insight. But I'm not sure if Tara wants them to have the preview or to get the final product.
No, you get the final product only. No.
Okay.
You may recognize some of the questions and the points for tomorrow. I'm just saying, that's all I'm going to go with. Thank you so very much. That was very, very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us. Good night.
Good night. Okay, Tara.
Okay. Did everybody get the presentation? I sent it out really kind of late for everybody. Thank you, Diane, for sending that and out. It was very quickly, roughly thrown together with a couple of points from a couple of folks. Andrea has actually, thank you very much, provided some, I don't know, is that okay with everybody? If everyone wants to?
Yeah. If you're good with sharing it on screen, then we can share it on screen. Yeah. I know it's going public tomorrow, but
I actually have a second second computer up right now. I will just
oh, it's up here.
Oh, I know it's there, but I'm going to update and type since I have to. Any updates we make to there, we'll do that. Did anybody get a chance to read it? Does anybody have any specific points, or do we want to just kind of comb through it and then questions as we go through? Not sure. I know we've been on for a long time, so I want to be sensitive to people's time.
I mean, I'm okay with going through it. I don't know if everybody's had. Sorry, go ahead, Donna. I saw your hand raised.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't know if everybody's gone through you, but go through it. But I just a couple of points on the transportation and the technology. We have to reword that a little bit to reflect what was said tonight.
Yep.
It's not quite the same.
Yep. No, absolutely. I am very much. That was one of the ones we had already highlighted, so that was really good. Okay, do we want to start at the front? Is everyone comfortable? What I've got there is well, the front page, but this is something that we've had in almost all the presentations. I kind of call it our mantra, saying this is why we exist.
Yeah.
All students can succeed. Technical paper challenges. Just based on the technical, some of the challenges, I kind of blurted out I thought what were some big ones. We can take things out, we can add things in if people feel strongly one way or another. That's all I'm really looking for. The couple really big ones, just around, with everything going on with COVID, and just, we know that there's sort of this promise that funding will be provided, but we really don't have any idea on it, saying there's been money that's been earmarked for mental health, but we really don't know how much we're really going to be receiving on that. How, and over to where Carla's concern was, how are we actually going to make sure that we have enough PPE and enough cleaning material? Our kids are safe. So that was kind of like that big one, just to sort of say, we just really don't know what we've got or what we need. So I just wanted to call that one out. Technology, but Donna, how do we want to wordsmithy that one?
Well, I mean, it's actually a good thing that they've moved technology and the software into the GSNs. However, with it is basically with the province stopping provincial licensing, the board now has to look at that and look at licensing, and what we used to receive was equivalent to approximately 200,000 of software licensing. and we've only been given 35,000, and we're going to need, you know, we're going to, with technology on the increase, we're going to have to look at the needs around technology, and that how they fund that in the future is going to be really key, because that's, you know, if we're going to say spend 200,000, because and it more than likely are, because our technology cost of it, then giving us 35,000 isn't supporting the technology, which they themselves have said they want to increase technology online, you know, mandatory eLearning and all that stuff. That's my biggest thing. So the 200,000 is what we would have, I guess,
historically spent.
It was the cost of the software that we licensed through the ministry, I guess, is the best way to put it, Andrea, I think. And that we've only received 35,000, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, agree. From the provincial licensing, we had others such as Read and Write that we were funding internal through other means.
Yeah.
But fully agree that it's a reduction in what was formerly licensed provincially.
Okay, so if I said something, current licensing or actuals are actually much higher at around 200,000. And we're anticipating that to continue. So there's that gap between the 35K and the 200K. Does that sound more reasonable? Okay. Transportation clawback was due to, we just didn't actually bus anybody for the remainder of this past year. Do we just want to take that whole section out then?
I mean, there is a clawback, but the thing is that I think you have to recognize, even though the ministry has clawed back, what Carla said is that we actually kept it on the books. We took that out of reserves and gave that back, right? And in order for the busing companies to somewhat prepare around PPE and so forth. So I think it's important, though, that, you know, although we were, you know, we took it, it was a great thing that we took it out of reserves, is now we're going to meet the needs when we're looking at the increased needs around transportation, right? So any clawback shouldn't have happened.
Because we needed the money to start with?
Because we know
we're going to need it. We're going to need it.
But
we're going to need it, yeah. Okay.
You know, yeah.
Okay, so how do you want to phrase that? Or is everybody okay with keeping it in, or do you want to just thoughts, comments?
Tara?
Yes.
It's Carolyn. I have a question. Just in the phrasing where it says to encourage students to find alternate means of transport to school, like what is that? What are these alternate means if they're being?
I think it was reduced dependency on school busing, so find your own way there.
Actually, if you look at the ministry's guideline planning for boards, it's online. It actually has there where school boards are to focus on those students that absolutely need, and that we should encourage students to find environmentally friendly and other methods of getting to school. That's not feasible for our students with special needs in particular, right?
Okay, that's why I was wondering. I'm thinking, well, they're being bused. How else are they going to get to school?
Yeah, and that's the key thing. And I guess the other thing is that one of the things that's one of my bugs is that between our coterminous board, we have the largest number of small buses, which means those are students that have to get to school on those small buses. There's no other way. And so how that is, we know there's going to be an increased cost. And so, you know, I just, at this point in time, I'm just saying that recognizing that you know, our students with special needs can't change their mode of transportation. They require it. And we recognize that there's going to be an increased cost, and the clawing back for fuel surcharges made no sense. But again, recognizing that we took that out of reserves. We're preparing our busing companies, right? So I think we should give credit where staff is due, where they've kept the money, but recognizing the government has clawed back, and we don't know what that's going to look like in the future.
Okay. Okay, I'm not sure I know how to phrase that one. Donna, if you want to think about that, and maybe if
I
someone
will,
has
because
a,
I recognize you're on a short time frame. I don't understand why you were only given 5 minutes instead of 10, but I mean,
so I did talk to Kristen. Apparently it was 5 minutes last year. I remember it being 10, but that's okay. That's just me.
I think we always just give you guys 10, and
No.
I don't know.
Okay.
We pretty much, because there's usually not a lot of presentations, but I will try to rework the wording in my head, because I'm very much better at writing things than verbally speaking.
That's fine. I have to send the final presentation to Kristen tonight. So, and I did promise it to her. So I'm in a slight bit of a time crunch on that one. Okay, so we'll go past that one. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments or anything else? The only other ones I had, it was just some concerns around staffing. So it looks like that we got the replacement for the local priorities funding with the other agreement. So I'm not sure if the points understaffing and the technical challenges are relevant or of deep concern to anyone at the moment. Are we okay with removing those points for now?
Tara,
yes.
It's Kathy. Sorry, we're trying to use the hand thing. I think Hannah might have something she wants to say too, but I don't know if people are seeing them. But I might not put in the full day kindergarten and raise that specifically in the grand scheme of the chaos that is trying to, like, I know there's a million different ways you can do hybrid, and trying to narrow it down, and all of that is huge. I don't know if in SEAC's defense, that's the priority in terms of staffing and budget. I think your second point, though, really does speak to the heart of how this works, because a lot of the ways that we've supported our students online has relied a lot on parents who were home, who are not going to be home anymore. And so a lot of that, and expecting teachers to be doing both jobs at once, and the learning that is like all the teachers did to learn how to support our kids with their needs and their IEP this year is gone. They're with a new teacher, and that looks different. So I think that I don't want to lose the second point for time. Like, I think that the second point about the students with home and online and all of that in terms of the staffing pieces is huge.
Okay. I do have another section. So the only reason I might take that point out here, because this is really talking about the challenges on the technical paper for the budgeting standpoint.
There.
I've got the next slide. Andrea, if you could to the next slide. Thank you. SEAC concerns. I do have a whole section on that one, just talking about the whole remote learning thing. What are the impacts, not just the caregivers, they're not teachers, and our students, our support needs are greater. So this was support staff. That one was there, the line in blue, especially for those with small class placements. I personally watched some online learning occur with my own children, and everyone's experience is different. Back to Andrea's earlier comments that some children actually thrived in this environment. They thought it was fantastic, and some kids just nope. And you have everyone's different experiences in terms of, we just completely shut down and said we didn't even do any learning at all because we knew it wasn't going to happen. So how are we going to re-engage in all of those children, and what does that support look like? And then what does that resourcing and then funding for that look like, and tying it kind of back into the budget discussions. So I know we've got a lot of concerns about the model itself. I'm trying to always tie this back into what does that mean to the monies that we are or are not receiving. So that's what I'm trying to, how do I phrase it so we get that point across? Yeah.
But sorry, I guess because I think that what you phrased is for the integrated kids, because isn't the small class placement going to have daily instruction face-to-face?
That's the intent. What if the parents refuse to send their children in?
Yeah,
because they're afraid or they're vulnerable for and susceptible. They're going to have to still have access to education. So we still have to support them and that sort of thing. I could probably take out the, especially for those in small class placements, is just how are we supporting our at-home students, period. Does that make more sense? It makes it a little bit more generic. So
Yeah.
because we do have that model that Director Marsh, sorry. Oh, goodness me. Nora and Marsh. So if I take that out and just say staff support for students at home learning.
Tara, this is Hannah here.
Hi, Hannah.
Yeah, so I just had a comment, perhaps some thought, and it's connected to a bit of the technology piece here and the part here you're talking about the IT support and access to technology. And similar to Catherine's point there, as well as that, you know, for families where they aren't going to necessarily be sending their children to school for various different reasons, you know, and it is the families that are still supporting them. One of the thoughts was just having access to some of the licenses and the subscriptions, and I'm wondering if that was, and this might not exactly be for this budget, a question. It could be an Andrea question. It could be a larger discussion, but just so, for example, there's some, you know, subscriptions to different things that aren't on the DDSB kind of on learning the Learning Commons area that are specific to special education classes. So I was just kind of adding a point to the IT support and access to technology, but that is where the school board already has a subscription. Is it possible to give limited time access to the families, that kind of idea?
Okay.
So Hannah, thank you for that. I think that gives Tara some feedback, but it's certainly something that I'll take back with Superintendent Maliha and the senior team as well. We did release a couple of the licenses over the last few months because it gets tricky in terms of the intentional teaching behind some of them and the staff monitoring to move different practices, but there's certainly others for consideration. So I'll take that back broader than the conversation this evening as well. Thank you for that.
All right. So
Thank
Hannah,
you.
just speaking back to that, I'm going to include IT support and access to technology solutions, including the software licenses required.
Yes, that's
where
right.
So then just also speaking back to that, so it's not just about the hardware, it's about all the stuff that you use on the hardware.
Yes, that's
and
right.
Then how we actually provide the access to that license, then that can be that further conversation. That bring that. So back to Andrea's point. Okay, all right, I'll add that. Anybody else?
Nope. Looks good to me. Anybody else have anything?
I'll go to the next point on the SEAC concern. This was just a random bunch of things I had done and looked at the OSTF and the ETFO's responses. They were largely consistent in terms of a lot of their concerns, especially concerning their staff and their members. And then just some general items, but if there's something that's missing or a specific lens that doesn't make sense, please, this is our presentation. I just threw something at us. I figured a straw man was easier for us to get through. So the one in the middle, lack of timing for appropriate consultation with the SEAC regarding the budget. I mean, we literally just talked about it, and the deputation is tomorrow. You know, if you got to read the GSNs in June 19th, I never understand that after about page 4, so I stopped reading. So, and then again, because it's provincial wide for those numbers, you never really know what actually funnels down to the individual boards. So I sort of feel, you know, back to what this basically says, we have a lot of children that have a lot of struggle with change. Routine is important, and there's going to be additional stressors on our kids to whatever this new normal is going to be, and just how do we make sure that we've got the appropriate, you know, inputs in from all of our lenses, because everybody has different stressors and different needs and different things that we have to consider on that. I just want to make sure that that was just sort of not lost, to say we got very limited time to sort of throw this together. So we want to make sure that we still get some feedback in as things develop through. That was really all I was going through with on that one. Is that one okay? I tried to wordsmith it as best I could.
Donna's got her hand up. Go ahead, Donna.
Yeah, and again, you've worded it like, again, staff have done the best because that's when we received it. However, under the Education Act, you need the public consultation, and it's a duty for SEAC to look at budget and have input into budget. And I think it's important for the ministry and collectively the public understand that we've done this. But again, I think it's really important the role of SEAC be inserted in there, and the fact that we have done it, but there's still a very, very short time frame, and no faults of staff. I mean, we got it, when we got it, and they actually did a phenomenal turnaround actually. But I think that it's really important to ensure that SEAC's role is highlighted in there.
Okay. All right. Yep.
Sorry, there was one thing I was going to mention on the last thing for recommendations. We talked about continuing to lobby the ministry to review the funding model. Maybe we should also add to that to review the funding model and use the current census data as opposed to the 2006 data, to use the 2016 data. Because by choosing to continue using the 2006, they know that they are intentionally underfunding.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So we're going to utilize the current 2016 census data available, and include additional support staff to ensure physical and mental health for all. Okay. All right. Just wanted to quickly go back to, so for the mandatory e-learning, I asked the question, and we said we really don't know what that's going to do, but we've staffed as if there's no impact to if everybody decided to take everything e-learning. We decided that the board has staffed teachers in secondary as if everybody's in class. So does that sort of remove that, at least from a budget perspective? We know we have the whole other issue about what e-learning is as a learning strategy for children, but from a budget perspective, can I take this out?
I'd leave it in because we also don't know about clawbacks, right?
Okay. All right. No, fair enough. Okay. Do you want me to, okay. You know what? I'm going to do that. I might be able to at least put that into the speaking notes. Okay. E-learning. Sorry, just writing a note now. Thank you. Good point, Eva. OAP, Claudine, I don't know if there's anything specific, if that's still something we at least just want to put out there to say we still don't know again.
Yes, I think we should include it. Yes.
All right. Anybody else feel strongly one way or another? I think it's easy to forget about the non-COVID things right now. So I just wanted to bring those up. I also put in the new math curriculum as well at this point. I think that there's just still some confusion on when that's being implemented. So perhaps just leave it in as and this is still lurking around. We still don't know what that's going to do.
Yeah. I think they're both important to include, okay. And I'm concerned if we don't keep focus, bringing back up the OAP, that it'll get lost in the shuffle and forgotten about.
Yeah, I'm on that. I'm with you on that one for sure. Okay. All right. So recommendations, continue to lobbying the ministry. Anybody have anything else on?
And just a comment in that please try to avoid using acronyms, because not necessarily all our trustees around the table are familiar with some of these acronyms that we are so used to using. So PPE, they do know that one. I can tell you that. But when it comes to some of the other ones, we need to spell them out.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'm actually going to, after this, I'm going to write down the words on cue cards for the points that I need to make. Just knowing that I've got 5 minutes, I could talk this through and it'll be 20. So I've got to pull out the salient points and make sure that that's there. The presentation is going to each board member, so they'll have it with them. They can see all the bits. I just want to pull the highlights out, so I'll make sure that I put the full words in on that and do that. Thank you, Hannah. Please let me know if you have anything else that jumps out at you. Just fire off an email for me, and I can add even speaking notes. I can do that. So, last couple of slides. Those are what I call the stock files. Our commitments to continuing to advise and make recommendations for exceptional students. Request our members work with their respective organizations to continue to affect positive change and continue to advocate on behalf of our exceptional students. Thank you for the wordsmithing, Andrea, and the apostrophes. And then just a thank you and conclusion on that. So that's it. That's really where we're going to go with the pieces. Yeah, that's all I have. Is there anything that's bothering anybody, or any other comments that, or something that's missing that we want to make sure gets added?
All I have to say is thank you, Tara, for throwing this together at the last second and taking your time out of your summer to go and present this at the board. I appreciate it. More than you know, I appreciate it.
No problem.
Tara, given that you only have 5 minutes, I think you've got more than, as you said, if you were to just extrapolate on any of those points, you could easily draw it out. So I think as long as you hit the big points and as long as everything is given as a document to the trustees and what have you, they can look at it at their leisure. I think that's the best representation.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so if that is all, we will move on to the update for the summer supports for students.
Thank you, and just very quickly this evening, just wanted to bring you updated as it is a $500,000 investment in our students receiving supports over this summer. So you may remember that it was just shortly about a month ago that we received $520,000 for summer supports in 3 buckets. One is support for summer learning. So I am thrilled that we have 516 students with IEPs registered for summer learning programs who will be supported by CERTs, EAs. We have Speech Path. Kathy Logren, a member of Lisa's team, is doing consultation to summer school, which is fantastic, as we know that communication largely sets up student success. And one of our students will have interpreter support for her coursework as well. So this is great news. The team will be working in partnership with ESL coaches as well, as another 28 students will be funded through the summer learning grant. So this is amazing news for us. And we look forward to the outcome. The CERTs, the team on the virtual learning hub, because they're operating out of a space, their energy is just contagious when you meet with them about the possibility of the role and what we can learn from summer school through a virtual learning hub to support kids no matter what environment and structure we're in September. Some really great learning that will come from that team. So that's kind of that first bucket. The second bucket is the continuity of clinical supports and mental health. So the teams have been reaching out to individual students and families to offer out continuity of mental health supports across the summer. Lisa's team also tiers into that. We also have the ability to bring new students on for single session and connect points. And so very shortly, within the next week, you'll receive an email from us just highlighting a button being added to the DDSB website, so that if a family is in crisis and looking to connect with a mental health worker over the summer, they don't need to navigate if the school team's available or who do they contact at the Ed Center. There's going to be a button on the website. I need to speak with one of the DDSB mental health workers, and that'll link through to a small consent form. And we've got people monitoring what we affectionately call the button to connect with families in that regard. So we've got continuity that way, as well as some podcasts going out for adolescents and other positive strategies for that. And then the third bucket is our transition program that will see approximately 5 to 6 students per school across 130 sites, augmented transition supports for the startup to school. So I think the dollars will be very well utilized. I give credit to the ISS leadership team for mobilizing it in a very quick timing, as well as our administrators in schools. I think the distributive model for transitions puts it as close to the kids and really impacts the value of that. So I give credit to the ISS leadership team, our union partners that have also helped immobilize across all 3 of those buckets. We would not have been able to do this without their support. So I credit all 3 organizations that we work with that way, as well as the brainstorming with local boards as well. There's an incredible similarity in how we've rolled it out across our systems across a few boards. So that's kind of a $500,000 summer spend in a nutshell. And then, as I said, the only other update I wanted to draw your attention to was the information in the board agenda for tomorrow evening. But thank you for the opportunity to have touched on that earlier. And that would be our update.
Great. Anybody have any questions with respect to that? Or any comments to go along with it? I'm going to add my comment that I love the idea that we're able to support kids with issues with mental health through the summer. I know that Kids Helpline is overwhelmed, not just with kids right now, but with adults as well. So I think it's fantastic that we can step in and help with kids right now. So important stuff. Does anybody else have any questions or comments with respect to the summer learning? No? Okay, moving on then to association reports. Does anybody have any association reports or anything to bring forward? No?
I can share. It's Claudine from Autism Ontario.
Hi, Claudine. Go ahead.
We're just sharing some celebrations. We are still doing pizza, cookie drop-offs, but on Saturday we're having bingo. So we're having 2 sessions of bingo through Zoom virtually, and we'll be having more game nights.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, all signups on Facebook on Autism Ontario, Durham region.
Is that something we could tweet out?
You sure can.
If you want to send send it to Andrea the information.
Great. I'm just going to take it off of Facebook and share it with you that way.
Perfect.
All right.
Anybody else have any association reports to bring forward? I would say for the Association for Bright Children and just sort of across the board, some of the things, I'm hearing from parents with kids with special needs is the concern around sort of how much involvement SEAC is having in the planning of the new school year and how that will look. I don't know what committees are happening at the board, but whether or not they want to, reach out to SEAC members to provide input on the plan and what specifically the special education, around the special education. It sounds like the small class placement they're attempting to go ahead as normal with those classes, but for the kids who are supported in our classrooms or maybe supported online. Yeah.
Sorry, that's fair, and we'll take that back as well. It would likely come on the hindsight of Ministry of Approval of any plan, so that as we work through the details, but we'll certainly keep that in mind.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and the other thing I sort of picked up along the way, we were talking about the streaming of the classes in grade 9. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm under the impression that the kids who are in CARE, the programs who are supported through Grove that are in the high school program, their classes have tended to be in the applied areas only. Am I correct in that?
I would say certainly it would be a trend, but it is not exclusive. We have students, one of our students who we were just celebrating last week was finishing his 12U chem within a Grove program. So I think there would be a trend, Michelle, jump in, but certainly not a predetermined pathway.
Okay, yeah, because that would be a concern of mine for sure. Okay. All right, is there any other association reports or anything, celebrations and successes to bring forward? Go ahead, Tara.
Adam had his graduation ceremony and he won the Citizenship Award. So it was so exciting. There was much jumping and screaming. There were a few tears. I got texts from the other family members. My nephew was jumping up and down screaming in his living room because we had no idea. It was so amazing. My husband was in the dining room with him. So I mean, they did an amazing job. I can't considering everything that's gone on with all of COVID and things get canceled and you can't have the grad ceremony, the dance and that's it. They did an amazing job putting this presentation together and they did such a great job. And Adam was apparently just loving the adulation from his peers in the online in the Google Classroom that they had set up on the side. You know, he's doing a few dabs and yeah, that kind of thing. So it was absolutely awesome. So I think he had his teachers in stitches the whole time, but so that was my proud mama moment for the month. So
good for him. Good for him. God, time goes too fast. Donna, go ahead.
It's not an associate report, but I just wanted, I don't know if everybody's is going to be aware, especially our students that are involved with Special Olympics. They have decided to put, there was supposed to be a spring games, it wasn't held. So they have a virtual games going on. It just started. Actually, I missed opening ceremonies, but it was at 7 tonight. But they have different challenges for different sports. And I'm just wondering if that's something that we would want to pass out to our students with special needs that might want to participate in the virtual challenge as far as that's concerned. But it's really, they have about 6 different sports. Rhythmic is one of them. Hey. Anyways, and they have instructions on what the challenges are and you can submit them and so forth. There's also a healthy athletes challenge. So I think it's really cool.
That's fantastic. Okay. Anything else to report? Okay. If there's nothing else, our next SEAC meeting will be Thursday, September 17th, 2020. And I'm not sure where that will be, online or in person. I guess that's all up in the air still. So would anybody like to make a motion to adjourn? Tara, second? Rowan, all in favor? All right. Have a fantastic summer, everybody.